Hello, my name is Ryan Oates. Welcome to A Perfect World, a series where we'll dream about the way things could be. Ranging from protecting our environment to promoting social justice, we'll take stock of where we are now and strategize about how we get to a perfect world. For our first episode, I've selected a topic that has fundamentally shaped the way I understand the world, and that is the outsized role of money in politics. In a perfect world, I believe that the government should be responsive to the needs of the people. I want to live in a world where if the majority of people want a certain law, then the government would enact it, as long as everyone's rights are being protected. I want to live in a world where anyone could run for public office and have a real shot at winning. Ideally, we would be in a debate of ideas. And if you could convince people that you had the best ideas, you'd have the biggest chance at winning. My hope is that we can live up to Abraham Lincoln's vision of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And right now, to put it bluntly, we have a government that's failing to meet that promise. We've seen a steep decline in trust in government. In 2023, only 26% of people said they had a favorable view of Congress. And keep in mind, this is supposed to be a group that is representing us. Since 2010, people have consistently felt that the country is on the wrong track. So what's the problem here? How does the role of money in politics prevent us from getting a government that does what people want? In 2014, researchers Gillens and Page set out to address this question. They wrote a paper called Testing Theories of American Politics: Elites, Interest Groups, and Average Citizens. Its goal was to ask which sets of actors have how much influence over public policy: average citizens, economic elites, and organized interest groups, whether mass-based or business-oriented. And here's what they found. So in a perfect world, the graph of an effective democracy would look like this. As more people support a law, it becomes more and more likely to pass. If 70% of people support an issue, it would have a 70% chance of becoming a law, and so on. But when the researchers mapped out the influence of everyday people's opinions on outcomes, the real graph looked like this: an absolute flat line. And that means that if no one, literally 0% of the population, agrees with something, it has a 30% chance of passing. And if 100% of people support it, it also has a 30% chance of passing. When I first saw this graph, I was obviously disheartened and a bit confused. But when I saw the rest of the graphs, the story became clear. This is the chart for economic elites. You'll notice, and this will likely come as no surprise, that the slope of this line is pretty darn close to the slope of the ideal. So if billionaires want something, it passes. The next graph tells a similar but distinct story. This is the graph for business-affiliated interest groups, organizations backed by oil companies or companies that make opioids. And similarly, when businesses want something from the government, they get it. All this to say, it's no wonder that no one trusts the government. Policies with wide support don't get passed because they go against the interests of the ultra-wealthy or corporations. And so it's not a surprise that many people are upset about this. The issue has been raised by all kinds of people, from progressive activists to even Donald Trump. In 2015, then candidate Trump, who was running as an anti-establishment outsider in the Republican Party, described the corruption of money in politics, albeit in his own self-incriminating way.
And you said recently, quote, "When you give, they do whatever the hell you want them to do."
I will tell you that our system is broken. I give to many people. Before 2 months ago, I was a businessman. I give to everybody. When they call, I give. And you know what? When I need something from them, 2 years later, 3 years later, I call them. They are there for me. And that's a broken system.
To be clear, I disagree with Donald Trump on pretty much everything. And in many ways, he kind of epitomizes the corruption of money in politics. In his 2024 run, he personally asked oil companies for $1 billion in exchange for a loosening of regulations on oil. Doesn't get much more blatant than that. But I think he did one thing well here, which is that he validated people's frustration. Our campaign finance system is bad. It is corrupt. And it feels good to hear someone say that out loud. But what he doesn't do is he doesn't offer an accurate story as to how we got here and how we fix it. So let's make space for that. What is it that allowed the ultra-rich to capture our political system? And how do we take it back? It's hard to choose a starting point for stories like this. And going back to the political cartoons of the late 1800s, you can see traces of people's anger that corporations and the wealthy had undue influence. There's this cartoon in Puck called The Bosses of the Senate. And you can see these tiny members of Congress looking up to their bosses, the Copper Trust, the Steel Beam Trust, all these old-timey sounding corporations. And the artist here is demonstrating through the body language and the positionality how these representatives are, in reality, at the will of these corporations. There's another one called The Infant Hercules and the Standard Oil Serpents, where Teddy Roosevelt is baby Hercules about to be attacked by John D. Rockefeller, the owner of Standard Oil. And you can see how powerless these political figures look in relation to the people around them who have money. Looking back on these cartoons can feel oddly resonant with today. While the industries and the business names may have changed, the dynamic that money corrupts our political system and prevents the people from getting what they want has largely stayed the same. So what's happened between then and now? How have the rich and large corporations cemented their control over our government? The modern story of money in politics starts in 1971 with what is known as the Powell Memorandum. Lewis Powell wrote this confidential memo for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and in it, he advised the chamber that businesses must learn the lesson that political power is necessary and that such power must be assiduously cultivated. He's talking here about a concerted, intentional effort by the business community to exert influence over the government. In other words, instead of the government regulating businesses, he's imagining that the businesses will regulate the government. There's actually a term for this in economics, which is regulatory capture. Powell also told the chamber that they should focus on exploiting judicial action to benefit businesses. And this is where the courts come in. While this Powell Memorandum could have been written off as this random, insignificant pipe dream in the business world, it becomes much more relevant as we follow the career of its author, Lewis Powell. In 1971, Powell himself was appointed to the Supreme Court by President Richard Nixon. And in 1976, when he was a justice, the court heard one of the most important campaign finance cases in U.S. history, Buckley v. Valeo. When it comes to campaign finance, Buckley v. Valeo set a fundamental legal precedent that, in terms of political spending, money is a form of speech. And based on that logic, any limitations on the use of money for political purposes were in violation of the First Amendment protections of free expression. On the one hand, I could understand this line of thinking. If a person wants to share their ideas, there can be costs associated with sharing them publicly. But in 2019, Ellen Weintraub, the director of the Federal Election Commission, took a different perspective. She wrote that Buckley's rule is that limiting political spending improperly restricts speech because it restricts the quantity of expression. An alternative perspective is that failing to limit spending improperly restricts speech because large amounts of money can drown out other voices, denying the public the opportunity to weigh all arguments. Buckley v. Valeo led to this two-tiered system of free speech. There are the rich, whose money can create megaphones for them. They can buy political advertisements, make campaign contributions, etc. And there are those of us who are left shouting in the background. wondering how to get our voices heard. We need to see how this unlimited political spending from the rich is playing out on the ground and how everyday people are being impacted. And surprise, surprise, things are going pretty well for the rich. Since 1990, the wealth of the top 10% has nearly tripled, even as the wealth of the bottom 50% has remained the same. And since the 1950s, taxes on the top 400 families have been cut in half. So the Buckley v. Valeo decision has led to a government that is responsive to money. It sets the precedent that money is speech. And so the more money you have, the louder you can shout. But when it comes to corporations, the next big part of this story is the 2010 Supreme Court case, Citizens United v. FEC, commonly known as Citizens United. So if Buckley v. Valeo led to the precedent that money is speech, then Citizens United led to something that is even more bizarre and more overtly corrupt, which is to say that corporations are people. To put a fine point on that, let's listen to the discussion about Citizens United in the Supreme Court.
A corporation, after all, is not endowed by its creator with inalienable rights.
What the court has said in the First Amendment context is that corporations are persons entitled to protection under the First Amendment. Now,
would that include today's mega corporations where many of the investors may be foreign individuals or entities?
The court in the past has made no distinction.
So there you go. Money is speech and corporations are people. So therefore, corporations have the right to spend as much money as they want on the political process. What could possibly go wrong? Anytime someone's making a decision that impacts people like this, it's worthwhile to look at who's on which side. And in this case, the 5 justices who made up the majority were the conservative judges, all of whom were either appointed by Ronald Reagan or George W. Bush. Now, let's hear from some of the politicians who were the most outspoken against this Citizens United decision.
There are certain judges who are alleging that somehow corporations have the same rights as citizens. I don't accept that premise.
The billionaire class is not just satisfied to control the economic life of this country. They are moving aggressively to control the political life of this country.
I continue to believe that Citizens United contributed to some of the problems we're having in Washington right now. There aren't a lot of functioning democracies around the world that work this way, where you can basically have millionaires and billionaires bankrolling whoever they want, however they want, in some cases undisclosed. What it means is ordinary Americans are shut out of the process.
Especially, I think, in the wake of Citizens United, I just felt like working class people were kind of locked out in a very permanent way from politics and from pursuing elected office themselves, even though sometimes that's who we need to serve the most.
People's voices are being shut out of our democracy. Working class people, middle class people, and instead, we're seeing corporations amassing more and more power. When I was in college in 2017, Montgomery County, Ohio, which was right next door to me, was the overdose capital of the United States in the opioid crisis. And looking back at that, all I can think of is that the companies that had contributed to this crisis were giving political contributions to the very congressional committees responsible for legislating about the opioid crisis. So when it comes to talking about money in politics, this kind of pie-in-the-sky philosophical debate about whether a corporation might technically be a person in certain circumstances falls pretty flat for me, when the material reality, the role of money in politics, can be life or death. So all that to say, that's why we have graphs that look like this. Billionaires and mega corporations get what they want because they have these megaphones of money, while everyday people are left shouting in the background. Okay, enough about the problem. How do we get to a graph that looks like this? One where everyone's voices are represented in government, where anyone could run for public office and have a real shot at winning, even if they don't have connections to deep-pocketed donors. Let's look at some solutions. The obvious solution here would be for the Supreme Court to overturn both Citizens United and Buckley v. Valeo. That would set the legal precedent for common sense laws that would limit the political spending of the rich and corporations so that our democracy has a more level playing field for everyone's opinions. While theoretically that could happen in an instant, it's not looking likely anytime soon. For one thing, Donald Trump's appointments during his first term shifted the court dramatically to the right. Besides that, some of the justices, like Clarence Thomas, have ethics issues of their own when it comes to money in politics. His financial connections to billionaire Harlan Crow have piqued some people's attention, especially since the Supreme Court has heard cases related to the real estate industry, which Crow has a financial interest in. But if the court refuses to overturn these cases, then Congress could use its power to pass a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United and Buckley v. Valeo. And a small handful of members of Congress have endorsed an amendment like that, including Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, my senator, Elizabeth Warren, and Senator Bernie Sanders. The organization American Promise has created a version of this amendment called the 4-Hour Freedom Amendment. And actually 22 states have passed resolutions calling on Congress to pass it. All right, so we've talked about how to reduce the impact of the ultra-rich and corporations. And there's another question to the side of that, which is how do we lift up the voices of everyday people? Every campaign needs money. It's kind of a necessity in order to communicate with people. And so how do we create a system of incentives that drives those candidates to speak with all people instead of just those who have money? And in my view, the answer to that question is public funding of elections. The way that public financing of campaigns works is that once a candidate shows they have support from a certain number of individual people, they can opt into the use of public funds for their campaign. That way, instead of candidates being bankrolled by wealthy people, the main way they get their money is by showing that they have support from a wide swath of Americans. The city of Seattle, Washington has created a voucher system that's been seen as a model that could be used around the country.
It involves what are known as democracy vouchers. It works like this. Each local election cycle, all registered voters receive 4 $25 vouchers that they can donate to up to 4 city council candidates who have volunteered to participate in the program. It's funded through an annual $3 million property tax, which the city says costs the average Seattle homeowner about $8 per year.
We are the very first city in the country to adopt the program, so we are a model for the world.
Wayne Barnett is the executive director of Seattle's Ethics and Elections Commission, which runs the voucher program. He says it has 2 goals. One is to increase the number of candidates by making it possible to raise a lot of money without connections to deep-pocketed donors.
And the second is to broaden the base of contributors. I think up to that time, we saw that roughly only 1% to 2% of Seattleites ever contributed to a local campaign. And I think the idea was to really broaden that base.
And based on some local reporting, they've actually dramatically increased the number of people who are able to contribute to campaigns.
Wayne Barnett with the Seattle Ethics and Elections Commission says they expect 10% of people to turn in their vouchers this time around.
People are participating at levels they've never participated before. So 10% of people contributing to a candidate is unheard of. I mean, it's generally around 1.5% without the voucher program.
So these public voucher programs are one route to creating a campaign system that is more responsive to a broader number of people. Another option is what's called a public match program, where people give a small contribution to a campaign and the government matches that contribution to increase its impact. Denver, Colorado is one city that has enacted a public match program.
Denver voters approved this public financing of elections with 70% of the vote 4 years ago. And today, nearly $1 million total was deposited between 15 candidate accounts. Candidates are eligible for contribution matches. For every $5 someone in Denver gives the candidate, the city gives them 9 times as much, an additional $45. That match works for donations up to $50, when the city will give the candidate an additional $450. Here's how candidates qualify for that public money match. They have to certify that they want to participate in the Fair Elections Fund. Clerk and Recorder Paul Lopez did so on January 1st, 2020. Councilwoman Amanda Sawyer did it last week. That date represents when the match can begin. But first, they need to receive a minimum number of contributions from Denver residents. 250 contributions for mayoral candidates, 100 for council, auditor, judge, or clerk and recorder.
So you can see how this public match program, similar to the voucher program, changes the set of incentives for candidates. Instead of being drawn to people with money because they're the only ones who can support their campaign, programs like this incentivize them to reach out to as many people as possible in order to earn their voucher. I'll be honest, thinking about the role of money in politics is kind of bleak, but seeing models like this give me hope that we can change things for the better. If you're interested in reforming the role of money in politics, I would recommend first supporting candidates who are advocates for free and fair elections. But beyond that, there are dozens of organizations doing this work. I'll list a few of them here. Of course, there are plenty more small organizations. You could just type "end money in politics" and your state. That's always a good way to get started. If you're interested in learning more about money in politics, I would definitely recommend Dark Money by Jane Mayer, an investigative reporter with The New Yorker. Anything by Lawrence Lessig, a constitutional scholar at Harvard, is great in this area. I really liked his book, They Don't Represent Us, as well as his podcast, Another Way. And in terms of documentaries, I recommend Saving Capitalism by Robert Reich. Trust me, saving capitalism is not a phrase I ever planned on saying, but it does do a great job of explaining how we got here. If you're still here with me, thank you for taking the time to listen. I know this is kind of a dire topic, but there's a James Baldwin quote that keeps me going in issues like this. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. See you next time.